Alright, this is Yalak here again. Today's date is August 29, 2016. And I'm giving some more of the history that helps to show what was going on at the time when the Christian church was being formed. And, if you're in the Christian church, or were used to going to church, and maybe you don't go anymore, at least you know that based on the New Testament, in particular the Gospels and the book of Acts, a lot happened there to really establish the Christian church as the last great move of God, bringing to a close what he was doing with the Hebrews, a nation of Israel, the patriarchs, and so on, that's found in the Old Testament. What I've learned, however, is that this Son of God trick, really being a sun god, was actually worked into the pages of the New Testament in a clever way. But, you have to understand that even the way that the New Testament is written, it just seems so holy and so from God. And when you don't do your own personal studies, you are left to believe it from the strong messages that are taught and preached in the Christian church, especially if you belong to charismatic churches. You can really be hooked, right? But also if you are in countries that are deeply Christian as a part of their culture, then yeah, you're going to be a part of Christianity and you can't move. Now, I want you to see what I'm going to share here. This is nothing new. Lots of other people have dealt with this, but I'm showing something that I found online and in a book I've got here I'm going to read something from as well, just to show you the thinking and the atmosphere at the time of the Roman Empire surrounding this New Testament teaching about Jesus Christ, the so-called Son of God. There was never a Son of God called Jesus that was sent from heaven, sent from the Creator, right? It's a trick. What we need to do is to keep the commandments, return to the law of the Most High, and keep the Sabbath and so on, right? That's what we need to do. So I found a website here. It's too long to read, but it's from WordPress.com. I think I can see a part of it here. Something about error cult, early Christianity, some recent studies, /WordPress.com, something like that. Anyway, if you go to WordPress.com, you search for Larry Hurtado's blog. That's Larry, HURTADO''S, Larry Hurtado's blog. Then you'll find this document I'm about to read from. It's entitled Roman Emperor Cult and Early Christianity, Some Recent Studies. And I'm trying to show here that the emperors were divine, right? That's how they were treated. So when you look at this Jesus, it wasn't Jesus, the Son of God, that was sent from heaven, that the Hebrews never know, even though New Testament teachers try to tell us that this same Jesus was in the Old Testament, appearing to the different patriarchs and prophets and so on. That's not true. Usually when you see an angel, it says something like malak, which means angel or messenger, right? Or man, and uses the word ish sometimes for man, right? From the Hebrew, right? Which ish, it's basically, it could mean just a man, but as you go on looking into it further, it could be also an angel, right? Or something divine, like Elohim, right? So it's letting you know that that man was of an angelic nature, right? And I'm pointing that out because someone asked me recently about who did Jacob wrestle with. And that's what it used there in Ish when it says a man wrestled with him, right? By the time you go into it, it says a man, meaning of a, Elohim or divine kind of nature, which would let you know it's talking about a man of an angelic nature. In other words, if he has an angelic nature, he's an angel, right? That's what it's trying to say, that he wrestled with an angel. So I'm trying to show here that the emperors were divine and not this Jesus Christ, right? Not this Jesus Christ. So I might entitle this Divine Emperors. So this document here, I'll only read a part of it. It says, in the ancient Roman setting in which the Christian movement emerged, the emperor was a towering figure, successively from Augustus onward, right? When you deal with names like Augustus, you're dealing with like these early church fathers and so on, right? I experienced a particular example of this myself a few years ago when visiting the Roman Theatre in Orange, France. And then he goes on, above the stage area stood a large statue of the emperor, signifying his superior status and role as patron of culture. Right? So if he's telling you that, basically you have to get in your mind, like I said, looking at the atmosphere and the setting that would have been around in the time of the so-called apostles and the so-called Jesus, the Son of God and so on, that they were dealing with a culture where emperors were treated as divine. They pushed it, they enforced it. It's like they wanted to be worshipped, right? Even Alexander had gone down to Egypt to get himself accepted by the Egyptians as a god. He wanted to be deity, right? And that caused huge problems, right? Right? He was a Greek and he wanted to be accepted in the African system as a god. Obviously, if he wanted to be accepted, and I touched on this in an earlier video, a few videos ago, I don't remember which video, but go look it up or study it on your own, right? If he wanted to be accepted as a god, that's because he was not a god. He was trying to make himself become a god, because religion really started in Africa, in African lands, right? They were the ones dealing with Horus, Osiris, the Ankh, Semiramis, all that kind of ancient sort of names and thoughts dealing with religious things. That's where religion is coming from. So they would have been the priests, African, right? They would have been the priests. And the early popes, or might I say precursor to the popes, are what the popes were made out of. They were made out of an African religious system. So he wanted to become a god, to learn from the people who were gods themselves, right? In their religious beliefs and systems in Africa, went to Egypt to become a god. Right? And I covered this already in another video, right? Like I said, talking about how he would go for a period of time, many days at a time, into very dark tunnels or caves and so on for meditations or whatever. They were guiding him and teaching him how to get to that state where he could cross over to being a god. Right? So these emperors were pushing this stuff. They wanted to be seen as divine because remember, they're on the prowl now. They're ready to conquer the world. They're setting themselves up, right? They conquered lands. They conquered the Africans. They conquered the Hebrews. They conquered different people. And now they're going to set themselves up as being divine, right? So it goes on, and that what we may regard as the opposite of culture, all gladiatorial contests were conducted under the emperor's patronage and dedicated to his honor. Of still more significance for early Christians, the emperor was treated widely as a divine figure. Now, the Christian does not like to read these kinds of articles. I know, because when I was in the Christian church when I was a boy, as short as to let my eyes be where my knees are, I didn't like reading these things. Anytime I came across this stuff, I ignored it completely. When I was searching for something to teach in the Christian church, if I came across this kind of stuff, I ignored it. I went to the library, I saw this kind of stuff, I ignored it. I took out other books, or if I needed that book, I would just ignore that part. Because I didn't want anything that would threaten or touch the Christian religion I was in. If you have to get yourself away from and close off real history, then maybe you really should be called a Christian. Because Christians are dumbed down so that they are told to rely on revelation from God instead of getting the natural earthly knowledge that's in the world. Why are people making so many books? Because there's some real history in the world and they're writing about it. But Christians say, now we don't need that, we just need revelation from God. Right? While there's somebody tricking you, setting himself up as an emperor to be divine, so he can be worshipped in Rome and in Jerusalem as well, in Israel as well, right? Where they say this New Testament was written and this Christianity started, right? So he was a divine figure as emperor, and this emperor to whom temples, altars, and priesthoods were dedicated. A recent book, and you see the Roman Catholic priesthood, you see how they get all these fancy garments and hats and so on that they have. They weren't wearing that originally before this Christian stuff was built up. They changed and put those garments on eventually, later on, right? Because remember, they were not into any of this God stuff talked about. Where do you read these Caesars and so on who later turned the popes in the Vatican system? Where do you read of in history that they were talking about the God of Israel and teaching from the Old Testament scrolls and quoting from prophets in their own lands where they came from before they conquered Jerusalem? Where do you read of these Caesars before they became known as Caesars in their lands coming to sitting before scrolls and talking about Elijah and Isaiah prophesied this and so on about Jesus? They never did. They started doing that because they conquered the Hebrews and took their scrolls and they said that, and so now in collaboration with sold out Hebrews from Egypt plus other people around there and so on, they decided to take it over and make something out of it and create the New Testament teaching. Right? I mean, you're talking about Greeks and Romans. They never cared about the prophets like Isaiah and Elijah and so on, right? They never did. Find me their teachings where before they hit Jerusalem and before they called themselves Caesars and popes, find me the records of them walking around teaching themselves about Isaiah and Jeremiah and Jacob and Abraham and Amos and Obadiah. Find me those records, please. So, a recent book, The Son of God in the Roman World, Divine Sonship. Let me read that again. The book name is called, that this man is quoting, the title of the book is The Son of God in the Roman World, Divine Sonship in the Social and Political Context by Michael Peppard, Oxford Unity Press, 2011. Focuses on this, and particularly on the frequent application to the emperor of the title, Son of God. So he's saying here that the emperor who was setting himself up as divine was also called the Son of God. And don't we find that title ascribed to the Jesus character in the New Testament? Right? I shall have more to say about Peppard's book in a subsequent posting, but since the pioneering work of Adolf Deisman in the early years of the 20th century, New Testament scholars have been interested in how the early Christians may have responded to the treatment of the emperor as divine, and what impact this may have had on the way that they expressed their faith in Jesus. Okay, if I skip some of that, it says also important is his analysis of how quote-unquote God language worked in the ancient Roman setting, and specifically how the emperor could be regarded as God, or gods and emperors, the Greek language of the Roman imperial cult. Price effectively challenged some earlier notions that Roman emperor cult was a sham, meaning that some people have been holding that it's a sham to say that the Roman emperor cult was true, was real. But he's like, no, he's challenging that because so much has been found about this, right? Because they're saying, oh, this Roman emperor cult and talking about the emperors were divine and so on and were called sons of God. They're saying it's not real. So if they can pull that off, then you can really go on believing in Jesus without any difficulty in your mind. But the moment it is found to be true that they were called, these emperors were called divine and called the Son of God, then it helps to piece things together to show how it was all a trick to get people to worship them as the Son of God and not a supposed Son of God that came down, that really came down from heaven. No, he never came down from no heaven. But basically, to sum up the next little part that I scanned through, he's saying that there is a difference between the Eastern and the Western culture in the way that they viewed the concept of deity and gods, as you know, as far as it having an influence on Christian theology, right? So if you're in the Christian church, you need to read some more about this, because I've been talking to quite a number of people recently, and they're defending this Jesus so clearly when there's so much out there, and they don't want to read these writings, they don't want to read these books, they don't want to do the research, and most of what these people are telling me is just really about faith. They're not talking about facts of what was found to be true in the early world, right? And coming up to the time of the Roman Empire, right? They're usually quoting scripture after scripture. Well, mostly New Testament verses. And they only dip into the Old Testament for one or two verses here and there that help to prove Jesus, which is not a bad idea, because if you're trying to prove him, yeah, you're going to go in the Old Testament to find this and that from Isaiah and so on. The problem is these people don't try to read the other many Old Testament verses that actually show that other Old Testament verses cannot be talking about a Jesus. Christians are more interested in the Old Testament for select reasons, as opposed to the Hebrews, who are interested in the Old Testament for the entirety of what the Old Testament says. Christians are very selective in how they read the Old Testament. They like the book of Psalms, and lately they haven't even been reading that much. And they like select passages from Isaiah and so on, because he talks about a prophecy of Emmanuel and so on that they think is talking about Christ. But it's just select stuff. They really don't care about the Old Testament, really. They're just going in it to get what they need and come out, to get enough to support New Testament. But anyway, I've got this book here, just to wrap it up, from, it's called the Atlas World of History. First published in the English language in 1987 by Burke Publishing Company Limited. It's not like a regular atlas with just like different cities in different lands and showing, the names of different lands and cities and so on. It's more giving, although it's got some maps in it, it's more giving history as it happened and tracing history throughout time, starting from what they call the origins of man. On page 23, dealing with Rome and its empire, this subtitle here says The Fortunes of the Early Christians, and I'll only read a part of it here. It's about one paragraph. They're saying Christianity spread in the empire, that means the Roman Empire, by the first disciples of Christ. And I guess they're saying kind of spearheaded by Peter and Paul, preaching and so on, right? And it spread, the Christianity spread despite the tradition of religious tolerance of the Romans. They were persecuted because of its denial of other religions and its refusal to recognize the divinity of the emperor. Now, this part here could trick you up, right? Because I've got some great stuff in this, but then sometimes some things you gotta be studying other things to understand it, right? Now, I've already taught that the Christians weren't the main ones being persecuted. They were persecuting the Hebrews, who didn't want to accept their Jesus, Son God religion, right? So once you do enough reading, and you see, even I just talked to another Christian person just recently, and they tell me, yeah, I've heard all this before, and I've studied all that kind of stuff, right? But you see, they're kind of shallow, because you have to read not just one book. Or you don't just talk to one person and you learn. You got to study, right? And when you read enough, if you're only reading one book, like this book alone, it gives some good information mingled with some confusing information. Like saying here, the Christians were persecuted because of their denial of other religions. Right? But when you read many more books and from other authors and so on, you understand that it wasn't the Christians who were primarily being persecuted, because Rome would not be persecuting the Christians who they're using to create their religion. It was the Hebrews being persecuted for not receiving this and buying into this religion, and they had to flee. But they only persecuted Christians who didn't want to accept their view of what would later become their setup of what would later become the Vatican system / Catholic system. That's what was going on. Because you had different quote-unquote churches, and the Roman Empire would go around trying to take over all these different groups, including even the Mithras temples and the Mithras religion, right? They were persecuted as well. It's not the Christians per se, right? Right? So they were taking over these Christian churches, and so these churches, I should say, and these churches would just be falling under the banner of what Rome was trying to set up to later become the new Christian movement. But they only persecuted the ones the small number of the ones who would resist coming under the authority of Rome and coming under the banner of what we know today as Christianity. Right? So it wasn't like mainly the Christians were being persecuted. No, just a handful of those, might I say, who were resisting. Right? And so when you go on reading this now, despite the religious tolerance of the Romans, the Christians, they're saying, or I'm telling you was wrong, was persecuted because of its denial of other religions and its refusal to recognize the divinity of the emperor. So basically they're trying to say they don't want to accept the divinity of the emperor. Remember, these people who were called Christians at that time were people of the Roman Empire, which included the Romans and the Greeks, but other people from other lands that had been conquered. Some of them were living even on the outskirts of the Roman Empire, like the Celts and other people, right? They were on the outskirts of the Roman Empire, and they were in general left alone, right? But all of these people around there, right, were for the most part tolerant of and participated in pagan religion and different religions. It was common and normal for people in the Roman Empire to have multiple religions. Multiple. The Romans, I think I read somewhere once they had like over 600 religions, right? They would tolerate all kinds of religions. Didn't matter. As long as you were willing to pay your taxes to Rome and to be in the empire and support the empire and so on, you could worship whatever god you wanted, right? But Mithras people were fought against and killed and slaughtered, and their temples taken over to start the Christian church services out of, because they were a threat and a competition to Christianity, because the Christian religion kind of came out of or modeled the Mithras Son of God Savior that was in the Mithras religion. So there was a Son of God in the Mithras, whose figure was even used to create the figure of this Jesus from the New Testament. But they don't teach you that normally in books. And so when I read a lot of, over the years, a lot of articles online or books about, or I go to the library, read a lot of books about the early Christians being persecuted, and especially too, the Christians have to keep in mind, when you see stuff like documentaries on TV about the Christians being fed to lions and so on, right? You don't see anything talking about Mithras. You don't see it. But upon deeper searching, I was able to find information on that. The Christian does not say, okay, well, if that was so significant that they were slaughtering Mithras people from the Mithra religion who were worshipping Mithra, why was that consistently left out of so many documentaries I've seen from a child on TV and in library books and so on? Why? And why is Mithra never mentioned in a Christian church? For the most part. Never, ever, 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 ever. The Christian has to think Let me go study that and see what they're hiding. And even right here, this is an atlas of world history. And they're still leaving out Mithra and the Mithras religion, which Christianity was modeled off to get their Son of God set up. It's because they do not want you to know the fullness of what actually happened regarding the atmosphere surrounding the creation of the New Testament and the worship of the so-called Son of God, Jesus. You got to go and study and learn the truth, right? So Rome would tolerate all this kind of worshiping and so on, right? And so when they're saying here there was religious tolerance, right? And Christians were persecuted because of their denial of other religions. Like Christians didn't want other religions. That's a lie. Because the Christians were often in multiple religions while they were in the Roman Empire. While they were in the Roman Empire. You see that? People in Rome had different religions. A lot of times. Alright, so and look here now, as I read this last part from it, the early Christians managed, they're saying that they met in cemeteries, catacombs, and so on, and the early Christians managed not only to survive, but also to spread their beliefs through the Roman Empire, despite attempts by Nero and others to exterminate them. And later, they were permitted freedom of worship by Constantine. What you're not keeping in your understanding, if you're Christian, is that they were persecuted. They were given the freedom to now worship under Constantine in the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. In 313, because they had fought off the Hebrews, killed some of them who left, who ran, who fled, because they didn't want this fake Jesus up, because their law tells them don't worship no other God. And they had exterminated the Mithras religion believers and taken over their temples, right? Because remember, Mithras and Christianity were kind of similar, right? In its setup and its teachings, with the bull and the Jesus Mithra Savior and all that kind of stuff. It was similar, so they took over the temples and used it, right? So when it's saying here now, in closing, that the Christians were permitted freedom of worship eventually, it's because they did all this kind of fighting and conquering of the people who didn't want their Christian religion that they were setting up from the New Testament. Once they got those ones out of the way, the Mithras people and the Hebrews to run, and the handful of resistant Christians, then they could set it up and go mainstream. And remember, when you read the precursor to the book of Acts scenario, those people in those churches that they were converting over to what we now know as Christianity, they were doing what? Not believing in Jesus. Because remember, we're told that Christian churches were found in other lands, in Africa, Ethiopia, and Egypt, and other places before Jesus even came, right? So now I say Christian churches, I should probably just say churches, right? Which means people were gathering, right? And sometimes when he's saying churches, you have to think as well, it was these temples of the other gods, right? Zeus, Mithras, and so on, and the Hebrew congregations where the Hebrews would meet and teach from their scrolls, right? Right? And so these congregations now, they would go and stomp them out, right? And then once they overcame them and killed them, or they fled, then now they could set up Christianity. Now they were free, because why? They were free to now, with the Edict of Milan, make it mainstream that the Christian religion is now free, getting free good status in the Roman Empire. Why? because they had been successful in conquering all those who were resisting them. And these early churches, before the Roman Empire really took them over and killed and so on, these early church gatherings, some of them were Old Testament law-abiding people. They were Hebrews, and even some people who were not Hebrews were learning from the Hebrews, right? And were learning of the law. And so to stop the people in the Roman Empire who were Gentiles from learning from the Hebrew groups, the Hebrews had to be killed and chased out so that they would stop converting Gentiles. But these groups that were meeting, that we normally call churches today, in a lot of cases, prior to this, Christians have been set up by Constantine and so on. In a lot of cases, those early quote-unquote church groups were law-keeping groups. There were Hebrew groups in some cases. And like I said, there were others like with Mithras and Zeus and so on. They and the other pagan religious cult groups, right? But some of them were Hebrew law groups, law-keeping groups. You see that? They were keeping the law. So they mingle stuff together. If you don't read now, if you don't read enough, you don't get to understand that these some, not all, but some of the early church groups were Hebrew groups. Just like today you have Hebrew camps here and there, right? There were Hebrews keeping the law and teaching their law who didn't want the Jesus stuff, right? But what is done now is they mingle all of these different groups, whether they're Hebrews or Mithras or Zeus followers, right? They mingle all of these cults together and just call them Christians, and saying the Christians were tortured, fed to lions, hiding in catacombs and so on. No, you got to read enough history from enough authors, dig, and you can start to separate stuff and see the real atmosphere of what was going on. Rome was fighting different people to set up their religion, right? And to pull off their New Testament deception, right? So the emperors were known as divine. They were gods, and they were setting themselves up to be worshipped, right? And that's where the Son of God stuff comes from, right? The Son of God, they always have them. And when you look at these, what do you call it? These deities, the half man, half God, slipping me now. But you know the deities. What's the word? Demigod, excuse me, demigod. In a part man, part animal, part divine or part spirit, part human, part fish, part human, and so on, part bird, part human, and so on, right? You know, wings of eagle, and legs of this, body of that, whatever, like in Zoroastrianism and so on. They had a lot of that stuff going on, right? They had a lot of that stuff going on. They were always into, I mean, there was just, you just got to read. There was a whole ton load of religious mess. And Rome was trying to straighten all that stuff out to bring them under one banner called Christian today. The Hebrews were never Christian. God himself is not a Christian and never told anyone to be a Christian.